All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us. We want to begin by thanking our sponsors. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Menachem and Susie Schoenfeld, for dedicating all the Shimon Drashos in memory of their grandparents, Moshe ben Shimon Leif Halevi, Sarah Leah Bas Dov Ber Halevi, Menachem Mendel ben Dov Ber, Sorayita Bas Yaakov Sender, Noach ben Avram, Fega Bas Meir, David Shimon ben Yisrael, and Sarah Bas Yaakov. We thank our Week of Learning sponsor, Jack Bennett, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drashos this week in memory of Sgan Uriel Peretz, who was a platoon commander in the Golani Brigade and died in a Hezbollah ambush in Lebanon in November of 1998. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Adam and Leslie Rosen, who are dedicating the Shiurim this week in honor of all the mental health care workers. Hashem should give them strength, support, and knowledge to care for their patients and themselves during this pandemic. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Yonasan and Rachel Wolf, with Akara Satov to the entire Kehillah, for providing Rabbi Yonasan with a Zoom home away from home during the coronavirus shutdown. We thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Akiva Kent and Hillary Jacobson Kent, in memory of Hillary's daughter, Shifra Bas Yoel. And we thank our DAF sponsors for today, Ryan and Lisa Phelps, with a DAF during Sfira sponsorship. We thank all of our sponsors for their incredible generosity. It's truly beautiful and heartwarming. And I will say with that, let us begin the Mishnah. So remember again, we are continuing now on the Mishnah on Ayin Hamid Beis. Today's DAF is Ayin Vav 76, but we are picking up in Mirz Hashem on Ayin Hamid Beis 75b at the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says as follows: Va'od klal achar amru. They said another klal when it comes to Shabbos. What's the klal? Kol hakosher lahatzniya umatzniyin kamohu va'otzia b'Shabbos chayiv chatos. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says that anything that is normally stored, kol hakosher lahatzniya means items that would normally be stored, umatzniyin kamohu, and people store it. So not only is it common to be stored, but ultimately, again, people actually do this. So we'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Kala kasher lahatzniya shuhumina asu l'tzarech ha'adam. It's talking about, meaning, what that means is something that people use. Something that people use. Umatzniyin kamohu, kamos zeh, kilomar sheyesh bo shia harei latzniya. So we'll say there are two things over here. Any item that is normally stored, and we assume that the item is also stored in a particular amount. So we'll say, let's say item A is something that people normally store in their homes. But it's not just a shot that this is an item. We normally assume that an item has to have a certain amount in order for a person to be willing to give up the space in order to go ahead and store it. So anything that is normally stored, and you have the requisite amount that is normally stored, Votzio b'Shabbos, and you end up carrying this item, let's say from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, or from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, or Dalet Amos in Rosh Hashanah, Chayiv Chatos. Ultimately, you're Chayiv Chatos. So we'll say, to say it's a little bit simpler, what the Gemara is saying is as follows. Essentially, in order to be Chayiv for Hotzah, it is not enough to go ahead and simply carry an item from one domain to another, or for that matter, to go ahead and carry an item Dalet Amos in Rosh Hashanah, but rather what has to happen is you have to carry something that is significant. If the item is insignificant, then halacha l'maisa, that's not hotzah. Because remember again, hotzah, like every other malacha, has to be a malachas machshavas, has to be a constructive, thought out, positive action. If what you're holding is insignificant, then by definition, that's not hotzah. So we'll say, so on a very simple level, for example, something that everybody would agree with. If you were to carry out a granule of sand, right, or a granule of salt, everyone would agree that's not hotzah. Now, you shouldn't do it, but l'maisa that's not hotzah. Why? Because a granule of sand or a granule of salt has no chashivos, it has no importance. So because it has no importance, therefore an act of carrying associated with it has no importance either. So therefore, the Mishnah's framing is a little bit of a different way. Any item that's normally stored, right, we assume it's also only stored if you have a certain amount. If you were to carry that amount out on Shabbos, you would be chayiv v'chatas for hotzah. The Gemara says, "V'chol she'enu kasher lahatzniya," but any item that's not normally stored, ve'in matzniyin kamohu, and therefore people do not store it. So therefore, v'otzio b'Shabbos, and a person goes ahead and carries it out on Shabbos. Then what? Eino chayiv ela hamatzniyo. Only a person who stores it is actually chayiv. So we'll say, let's analyze what this means for just a moment. Look at Rashi. Ein chiyuv ela matznio. Im na'aseh chaviv la'adam echad v'yitzniyo, chayiv al hotza'aso. V'im chazer v'hotzio, aval adam acher inu chayiv alav delagabei lav melachos. So let's say the following. So rule number one is any item that is normally stored, if you go ahead, which means that it's important to a person, and we assume that you only store it in a certain amount, if you carry that amount out on Shabbos, you are chayiv. But any item that is not normally stored, right, and you carry it out, you're not chayiv. Why? Because it's not chashiv. But let's say you have the following thing. Let's say item A. Let's say let's say this. Let's say a fistful of salt. So let's assume for a moment, right now, this is just for illustration purposes. Let's assume for a moment that a fistful of salt is not considered to be chashiv for most people. Let's assume that for just a moment. But for Ruvain, he holds that it's chashiv. See, he stores a fistful of salt. So what the Mishnah is telling me is, if Ruvain were to carry out a fistful of salt on Shabbos, he would be chayiv. But if Shimon were, why? Because Ruvain stores that amount. And since Ruvain stores that amount and that type of item, therefore it's chashiv. Because it's chashiv, Ruvain's going to be chayiv. But if Shimon, who holds that doesn't store a fistful of salt, he doesn't hold that it's chashiv, were to carry out that same fistful, he would not be chayiv. So we'll say quite fascinating. So what the Mishnah is actually telling me is, so much of Hilchos Shabbos is objective. Apparently, again, when it comes to creating a chashuv unit, a chashuv unit could be subjective. So what is chashuv for you may not be chashuv for me. You'll say, what's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is, if it's chashuv for you and you carry it out, you're chayiv echatos. If it's the same item, it's not chashuv for me, and I carry it out, I'm not chayiv anything. So we'll say that's the Mishnah. Let's analyze. So I will say, when we say something that a person normally stores, so obviously, anytime you see kol, right? Anytime you see kol, right? Kol HaKashla, anything that is normally stored, that's coming to exclude something. What's coming to be excluded in this case? So here, so this is quite interesting. So Rapapa Amar Lafuke Damnida, that if a person saves menstrual blood, so you'll say, why would a person save menstrual blood? So the Gemara says, look, if you look at Rashi, actually, no, I'm sorry, not yet. So Lafuke Damnida. Mar Ukva Amar Lafuke Atze Ashera. Right, well, Mar Ukva says, if a person is storing Ashera branches, right? Remember again, Ashera is a tree that was worshipped for Avodah Zarah. Someone has Ashera branches. So we'll say, Manda Amar Damnida, Kol Shekin Atze Ashera. So we'll say, the one who says that storing Damnida doesn't make it something significant, all the more so Atze Ashera, right? All the more so, again, branches of Avodah Zarah won't be significant. Manda Amar Atze Ashera, but the one who says Atze Ashera, Aval Damnida Matznea Leila Shunra. So apparently people would feed cats menstrual blood. I guess again it was the ability to reuse something that a person didn't have to spend extra money on. So the Maisa, they used to feed a cat menstrual blood. So the Gemara says no, people don't do that. V'idach kevan decholsha lo mitznale. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. The other opinion says no, a person would not feed a cat menstrual blood. Why not? Because it weakens the individual. Now, we'll say, now if you look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says, Kevan decholsha, ma'achil dam ha'adam lechatul, na'aseh chalosh osad. So we'll say the Gemara also talks about this idea that ultimately, again, giving an animal to eat of your blood, right, ultimately weakens the individual. So how exactly that works is more on an esoteric level, but Lamaisa, people wouldn't store blood, their own blood, in order to feed it to their cat. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Hay delo Reb Shimon. The Reb Shimon, I'll say this, our Mishnah obviously does not reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon. Why not? Again, we'll see this later on, because Reb Shimon said, Lo amru kalashirun halalu ela lematzni ehen. So Rabbi say, here's what's very interesting. Was we're going to see there is a more yesodistic machlokes over here. See, the interesting question that comes up is as follows. Do we create objective categories based on this principle? So for example, the way the Mishnah reads is, anything that is normally stored, and stored in a particular amount, if you go ahead and you transport that amount on Shabbos, you are chayiv. So we'll say, so the shaila is, how exactly does that play out? So do we say that essentially we look at what most people do? What do most people do? So if most people store item A in this particular amount, then even if I personally don't do that, we go basarov b'nei adam. We go after the majority of people. Or do we say no, that this halacha is mamish a subjective halacha? And what this halacha says is, we look at what's in your cupboard. If whatever you store and the amount in which you store it That's what creates a chashivos. But at the end of the day, if your neighbor does, and even if every other neighbor does, but you don't, then for you that's not chashuv. So we'll say that is a fundamental machlokus we're going to see between the Rabbanan, between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara just says this Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon said that halacha lamaisa, this halacha is subjective, that every person figures out what it is that they store and the amount in which they store it. That becomes their unit of chashivus, and if you transport that amount, that is when you are chayiv. But it could very well be that from home to home, from neighbor to neighbor, these halachos will be different. So also that's the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Gemara just pointing out our Mishnah clearly does not reflect that view, right? Our Mishnah understands that we are talking about principles, right? We're talking about principles, and the only time that, or constructs, and the only time that subjectivity comes up is we'll say l'chumra but not l'kula. So for example, if I store item A and no one else stores item A, halacha l'maisa, for me, it will be usher to transport item A in the amount in which I store it. V'chol she'enu kasher latzniyo, and anything that's not normally stored. So we'll say top of ayin vav, Amr Belazar, hadlok Reb Shimon Elazar. So we'll say again, this doesn't reflect the view of Reb Shimon Elazar, like we were just saying before. Disanya, klal Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, kol she'eno kasher lahatzniyo, ve'in matzniyin kamohu, v'huchsher lezeh, v'hitzniyo, uba acher v'hotzio, nischayiv zeh b'machshavo shel zeh. So we'll say, so this is actually quite amazing. So remember, let's just follow the train of thought over here, right? So the first stage of the Mishnah teaches me the principle that, or reinforces the principle, that in order to be chayiv for hotzah, you have to transport a unit that is chashuv. How do we define that unit of chashivus? By amount that people normally store. By amount that people normally store. So we'll say, so again, let me give you one more simpler example because I think it's easier to illustrate. Let's say people only store 2 and more eggs. Okay, I'm just getting illustration purposes, 2 or more eggs. Therefore, what the Mishnah would say is that the shear of hotzah for eggs is 2. 2 eggs. And therefore, again, if I only have 1 egg and I transport 1 egg, I'm not going to be chayiv. Conversely, the Mishnah says that halacha l'maisa, but let's say I, Shmuel Silber, I store 1 egg. I'm a 1 egg guy. Let's say I go ahead and I store even 1 egg. What's the halacha? The halacha is, for me, if I transport 1 egg, I will be chayiv. Why? Because subjectively, I have made the statement that 1 egg is important. It's chashiv. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, I will be chayiv even for 1 egg. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says something absolutely amazing. He says that once I make that 1 egg chashiv, if you were to come to my house and take my egg and transport it out, you would be chayiv. Why? Now look at the wording of the Mishnah. So Rabbi Shimon Elazar says, I've read the Gemara, Kol she'eno kasher latzniya, ve'matzniyin also kamo. So because Rabbi Shimon Elazar says as follows: anything that is not normally stored, and therefore doesn't really have a requisite amount that's stored. V'huchsher lazeh, but I decide to store it. So people don't normally store 1 egg, but I, Shmuel Silber, I store 1 egg, and what happens? Ba'acher v'hotzio. Reuven comes to my house, he takes my 1 egg, with my permission, takes my 1 egg, and he carries it out on Shabbos. Nischayev zeh b'machshava shel zeh. Reuven will become chayiv because I made the 1 egg chashuv. So I will say an incredible idea. What the Gemara is saying is, my machshava could create a reality for someone else. The rest of the world doesn't hold that 1 egg is chashuv. That is true. But at the end of the day, I was machshiv 1 egg. And because of that now, if Reuven comes along and carries that egg, even though Reuven holds, he would never store 1 egg. Whoever stores 1 egg, he stores only 2 eggs or more, because I was machshiv the egg, therefore halacha l'maaseh, he will be chayiv for hotzah. An incredible idea. Look at Rashi. Amar Elazar, diktani masnisin de'enu kasher latzniya ve'tznio acher hu mechayev hahotzah the kol adam peturin to Reb Shimon Elazar. So both say really an incredible halacha. So Reb Shimon Elazar holds that once I am machshiv it becomes chashav for someone else. Which Rabbi say tells you something. So that's the machlokes. It happens to be the Shulchan Aruch does not paskin like this. The halacha, the Rambam doesn't paskin like Reb Shimon Elazar. The Rambam really paskins as spelled out in the Mishnah, namely that halacha l'maaseh we create for the most part, objective constructs. So we look at food items that are stored, the normal amounts in which they are stored, and that creates the unit of chiyuv. The exception to that, of course, is I could create some level of subjectivity that if I normally store something and it's chashiv for me, then if I carry that out on Shabbos, I'll be chayiv v'chatos. But interestingly enough, the Rambam does not accept the position of Shem and Elazar, and halacha l'maisa, just because I machshiv it, that makes it chashiv and usher to transport for me, but does not make it chashiv and usher to transport for someone else. But I will say, if you think about that yisod, or Rosh Shimon Elazar, it's so incredibly profound. Now, be thinking about this, that my machshava has an impact on you. My machshava has an impact on you, according to Rosh Shimon Elazar, right? If I hold that it's chashiv, it makes it chashiv for you. Which, even though we don't accept this halacha l'maisa, understand the profundity of that statement. Right? Rosh Shimon Elazar is highlighting the interconnectedness that we have with one another, that what I think and what I do has such an incredible, overwhelming, dramatic impact on someone else. Sometimes we think that our actions just have a ripple effect around our personal island, right? What I do only impacts me, so I don't have to worry. It's not true. Everything we do, I must say, even to a certain degree, everything we think has an impact on those around us. How careful and how considerate and how vigilant we have to be with not only our actions, but also our machshavas. Incredible. Says the Mishnah, Hamotzi Tevin K'malei B'Pira. So I'll say, now, once we got into the fascinating topic of, we're back to Hotzah. It's interesting, we're back to Hotzah, but now again, in this discussion of Hotzah, so the focus is really on how much. How much do you have to, what's the unit of an item that has to be carried in order for you to be chayiv? So remember, the first Mishnah over here said, if you're carrying something that's stored, normally stored, so the amount you would have to carry in order to be chayiv ultimately is the amount that people normally store. Okay. Next, ultimately, is as follows: Hamotzi teven. What happens if you carry out straw? So the amount of straw to be chayiv for on Shabbos is kimole pipara, a mouthful for a cow. So I'll say a mouthful of straw for a cow. That's a chashiv unit, and if you carry that amount on Shabbos, you'll be chayiv. Eitzah. So we'll say, what's Eitzah? So Rashi says, we'll see in the Gemara what Eitzah means. Eitzah, kimali pi gamal. So Eitzah, if you carry that out, it's enough to feed the mouth, right, to put in the mouth of a camel. Amir. So the Gemara says, Amir. Rashi says, kashin shel shibolin. So ultimately, again, these are stalks, or straw really, as we're going to see. It's the straw ultimately of stalks of wheat. So Amir, kamale pitala, like the amount that can fill the mouth of a lamb. Asovim, grass, kimali pi gedi, the amount that you would put into the mouth of a goat. Ali shum va'ali bitzalim. So we'll say, so remember again, these are, so garlic leaves and onion leaves. Lochim, if they are moist. Kigro geres. Then we'll say you're chayiv if you carry out the volume, the amount of a dried fig. Yeveshim, if they're dry. Kimali pi gedi, enough to go ahead and fill the mouth of a kid. Ve'in mitztarfim ze'im zeh. But I will say these items do not combine with one another. Mipnei shelo shavu b'shiureim, because at the end of the day they have different shiurim. So I will say, therefore, you begin to see that for these food items, halacha l'maisa, in order to decide whether or not the unit of chiyuv is based on chashivos. So these items, as we're going to see, because they were often used for animal feed, right? The ones that are used for animal feed are measured by the amount that the animals would consume. Other items, as like we saw by the onion leaves and the garlic leaves, are given the shear of grogeres or kimali pigidi. The idea that the Mishnah says, however, is these shiurim, these food items, these sure don't combine with each other, which makes sense logically. Why not? Because the said they're not the same. In other words, when could items be mitzdaref to make a shear? When ultimately, again, the shear is the same for all. I'll give you an example. That let's say if I'm eating, chazer and nevela, right? Chazer and nevela, right? I'm eating chazer shalom pork and meat from an animal that didn't have proper shchita. So we'll say, so the shear of iser for chazer and for nevela is a kizayis. So one can make the argument that if you eat some chazer and some nevela, well-balanced diet, right, some chazer, some nevela, then halacha l'maisa, that's mitzdarif. Why? Because they have the same shear. But Lamaisa, the Mishnah says these items don't have the same share, therefore they're not mistarif. So my Eitzah, so what it says, what's Eitzah? This is the straw that comes from legumes. So we'll say, remember again, when the Gemara refers to straw is like the leftovers that comes from the plant that you are processing. So for example, there's straw from wheat, there's straw right from wheat stalks, and there's straw ultimately again from processing of legumes also. So Rabbi Yehuda says that's Eitzah, it's the teven, it's the straw from kitnius. Ki asur Rav Dimi Amar, hamotzi teven kimali pi para legamal. Suppose this is an interesting case. What happens if a person takes out straw on Shabbos, but he takes out the amount to put in the mouth of say it again. Hamotzi teven kimali pi para legamo. If a person goes in and takes out a cow's mouthful of straw, but he brought it out for a camel. Now take a look at Rashi. Hamotzi teven kimali pi para, votzio la'achilo legamo. Shepi gamal gadol mipi para. So we'll say, now watch this. So the Mishnah said that when transporting straw, so the Maisa again, what's the shear? The amount necessary to put into the mouth of a camel. That's the shear. Okay. So what happens, however, if on Shabbos I take out that shear, but I'm taking it out to feed my camel? Now, everyone knows a camel has a bigger mouth than a cow. So we'll say, this is a riveting question. So what am I doing? I'm taking out technically the right shear of straw, which is the amount to put into the mouth of a cow. But my kavana is to feed a camel, and the truth is, for a camel, this is actually an insufficient amount of straw. See, here the shaila, do we look at the objective category? You took out enough straw to put in the mouth of a cow. That's your chiyuv. Or do we look at your subjective circumstance? But what you took out is actually not enough to accomplish what it is that you set out to do. You set out to feed your camel, and the amount that you're bringing to your camel is insufficient for the camel. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv, Reish Lakish Amar Pater. So Rabbi Yochanan said that you're Chayiv, and Reish Lakish said that you are Pater. Listen to this. Ba'arta Am Rabbi Yochanan Hachi. So Rabbi Yochanan said it was Chayiv at night. L'tzafra Haderbei. The next morning he retracted his position and he said, Reish Lakish, you're right, I think you're Pater. Am Rabbi Yosef said, Shapir Avad Dahader. So the Rabbi Yosef said, Rabbi Yochanan Shkoyach, that you retracted. Daha lo chazi legamal. It makes sense. You can't be chayiv for this. So also remember again on Shabbos, you're chayiv for meleches machshavas, which means you're chayiv for ultimately doing constructive act. Bringing out a cow's mouthful of straw for a camel is not sufficient. So because of that, you did not really do a fully constructive act, and therefore you can't be chayiv. Amrle Abaye said no. Adraba kimedi ikara mistabra. No, I think Rabbi Yochanan was right. He should not have retracted. Why? Daha chazi lepara. Because at the end of the day, remember, what creates a chashivas for a unit is not necessarily subjective criteria, but objective criteria. That how much straw is considered to be the amount of straw for which is chashiv, the amount that it takes to go into the mouth of a cow. I will say, I'll take this even a step further. Let's say you weren't taking the straw out to feed any animal. You were just carrying straw. Some people just like carrying straw. So I'm carrying straw and I take out the amount that's necessary to feed a cow. I'm chayiv, right? B'pashas I'm chayiv. Because at the end of the day, Chazal created a unit of importance. So the fact that I'm carrying this out to feed my camel, and for a camel, a cow's mouthful of straw is not sufficient. Who cares? Lamaisa, you carried out the chashav amount. Elo ki asa Rabin Amar hamotzi tevin kimali pipara l'kuli alma lo pligi dechayiv. So Ravi comes along Rabin, and Rabin says no. Everyone agrees that if you carry out enough straw to fill the mouth of a cow, everyone agrees that you are chayiv. Everyone agrees that you're chayiv. So where's the machlokes? Ki pligi bemotzi eitza kimali pipara lipara. So I'll say, where's the machlokes? Listen to this. When you go ahead and you bring out eitza, enough to feed a cow. You bring out actually, let me say it straight. I'm bringing out atza, or eitza. So remember again, I'll say we said eitza is the straw that comes from legumes. So I'm bringing out eitza to feed my cow, and I'm bringing out enough to feed my cow. Then I both say, now remember, let's analyze this for just a moment. So remember again, go back to the Mishnah. According to the Mishnah, how much eitzah do you have to go ahead and carry in order to go ahead and be chayiv? What did the Mishnah say? Enough to go ahead and feed a camel, right? To put in the mouthful of a camel. As you said before, a camel's mouthful is larger than a cow's mouthful. So watch what's happening over here. In this case, Rabbi say, I am bringing out less than the requisite shear, as mentioned in the Mishnah, but it's enough for what I want to accomplish. So in other words, I'm looking to feed my cow. So I'm bringing out enough eitzah for my cow. But it's not the amount that a camel would eat. But that's okay. I'm not feeding a camel. I'm feeding my cow. But this is less than the shear as articulated by the Mishnah. So how do we look at this case? Do we say on one hand, you're not bringing out the requisite shear of chashivos, therefore you're patur? Or do we say, no, you want to feed your cow, this is enough for your cow, that makes it a chashava act, and therefore you should be chayiv. It's incredible kasha. So the Gemara says, ve'ipcha itmar, Rabbi Yochanan amar pater, Rabbi Yochanan says that you're pater, Reish Lakish amar chayiv, Rabbi Yochanan amar pater, achila al yedei adchak lo shma achila. So we'll say, here's what everybody agrees with. Lemaisa, if you were to feed the camel this amount, al yedei adchak, right? Under extenuating circumstances, it would be enough for the camel to survive. He'd be fine. He'll be absolutely fine. So Rabbi Yochanan says, achila ayedei adchak, right? Just being fine, right? Or extenuating eating, right? Is not called achila. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yochanan would say that you're pater. Reish Lakish amar achayiv, achila ayedei adchak, shma achila. On the other hand, Reish Lakish would say that you're chayiv. Why? Because l'maisa, again, even what we'll call extenuating eating, or not ideal eating, is still considered to be an act of consumption. Therefore, your act is still constructive, and therefore you're still chayiv. So we'll say, so the way the Gemara comes out is as follows. So the Gemara seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa, in a case where ultimately, again, you bring out enough straw, right? You bring out enough straw to feed a cow, but you're giving it to your camel. Everyone agrees that you're chayiv. Why? Because Rabbi say, remember again, that's what the Mishnah does for us. The Mishnah establishes objective criteria. So once you bring out enough straw in order to go ahead, or let me say it differently. When the Mishnah says that you're chayiv for bringing out enough straw to feed your cow, right, to feed your cow, that doesn't mean that if you're feeding your cow and you bring out this amount, you're chayiv. Rather, what it means is, Chazal are telling us the amount of straw that is considered to be chashuv, that would make you in violation of hotza'ah, is the amount that would fill the mouth of a cow. We don't care what you're doing with the straw, whether you're feeding it to a cow, whether you're feeding it to your gerbil, or whether you're using it as a pillow to lay down on. It doesn't matter to us. What matters is the amount that you're bringing out. So therefore, in a case where I'm bringing out enough straw for a cow, but I'm using it to feed my camel, and for a camel it's not enough, we don't care. It doesn't matter. You're chayiv because ultimately, again, you've brought out an objective amount. You're chayiv. So where does the machlokis come up, Rabbi Say? The machlokis comes up, says the Gemara, when you're bringing out an amount, let's say eitzah, which is again the straw from legumes, normally the amount that you'd be chayiv for is how much? The amount to feed a camel, which is a larger amount. You're only bringing out enough to feed a cow. But lamaisa, your intention is to feed the cow. So are you chayiv or not? So that's machlokis, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and the Rambam Paschal is like Reish Lakish. Namely, again, that Rabbi says, since you are doing a constructive act, even though only for you this is constructive, halacha l'maisa be chayiv. So Rabbi say, you see this incredible, almost like back and forth between, on one hand, we establish objective criteria. Therefore, once you've passed the threshold of objective criteria, you are chayiv. But you could generate personal chayiv if you do something that is chashiv, even if others would regard it as not chashiv. So, for example, even though the Mishnah says that by eitzah, the shear is the amount to fill the mouth of a camel, but you're bringing out less than that. You're bringing out only a cow's mouthful. But that's because you're feeding your cow with this eitzah. For you, that is a constructive act, and therefore you will be chayiv. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Amir kamale pitala. So we'll say if you bring out Amir, right, if you bring out Amir, so which again the Mishnah said is also straw. So ultimately, again, that's the amount that it takes to fill the mouth of a lamb. Tanya ki grogeres. But elsewhere we learned that you're chayiv for only bringing out the shear of a grogeres, which is the amount of a dried fig. To which the Gemara says, not a problem. Idi vi idi chad shiuru. It's the same shear. It's the same shear, same exact amount. al shum va'al bitzalim lochem kigro geres v'yeveshim kamali piyagdi ve'mitztarfim zeh zeh b'nei shalosha b'shir. So that's the last part of the Mishnah. So remember again, when you have garlic leaves and onion leaves, if they are moist, then halacha lemaisa, the shear is kigro geres, the volume of a dried fig. If they are dry, then it is the amount that could fill the mouth of a kid, but they are not mitzvah. They do not combine one with the other because the shiurim are different. This is actually very interesting. A mitzdarfen lechamer shebahen, aval mitzdarfen lekal shebahen. So we'll say, interestingly enough, comes on Rabbi Yossi Chanina and says like this. He says, when we say that these items do not combine to form a shear, that's only lechumra, but not lekula. What does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Im mitzarfen lechamer shabahem." Listen to this. Misha shiuro gadol havikal ve'inu mitzarfen lahashtem shiuro shel chamer. Daha lo chashiv kiahu. Aval chashiv mashlim es hakal l'shir tevin mitzarfen. So listen to this. When it comes to shiurim for these purposes, anything that has a larger shear, is a larger amount, is considered to be kal, more lenient. Makes sense, right? Because you need more of it in order to be chayiv. Anything that has a smaller shear is considered to be ultimately something that is more chamer. What the Gemara says is as follows: if you have an item that is kal, has a larger shear, that cannot combine with an item that has a smaller shear, which is more chamer, in order to allow that smaller item to fill out its shear. But an item that has a smaller shear, therefore is more chamer, can combine with an item that has a larger shear to form its requisite shear for chiyuv. So in other words, I will say, so simply stated, chumra could combine with kula, or I should say, chamar could combine with kal. I'm doing this and this because remember again, chamar is a lower shear, kal is a higher shear. So that which is chamar could go ahead and combine with that which is kal in order to form a larger shear, but that which is kal cannot combine with that which is chamor to complete its smaller shear. So the Gemara says, one more time, but is that true? In general, again, could things that don't have the same shear, can they actually combine to create a combined shear? Is that true? V'hatzanan we learned. Habeged gimel al gimel, v'hasak dalet al dalet. So remember again, we spoke about this actually before. We'll see it again in a couple of days as well, which is the following. Halacha l'maisa, different items contract tumah in different amounts. So for example, a beged, a garment, if it has gimel al gimel, right? Gimel tvachim by gimel tvachim, or gimel etzbos by gimel, depending on the item and depending on the person. Right? So if the beged is gimel by gimel, 3 by 3, it can be makabel tumah. Sackcloth is dalet al dalet, 4 by 4. Or leather, hey al hey, 5 by 5. Mapatz is which is like a mat, vav al vav. So we'll say all of these items have different shiurim for Kabbalah's tumah. The Tani Allah, and we learned habeged v'hasak, hasak v'ha'ar v'hamapatz mitztarfim zeh im zeh. Ultimately, yet we learned that what? That halacha l'maisa, these items can combine with each other, right? Even though they have different shiurim, they have the ability to combine with each other to form a requisite shiur. So Rabbi Shimon says, why is that? But if these items have dissimilar shiurim, then why can they combine ultimately to form a combined shiur? Why? Because they have a shared common denominator. What's their shared common denominator, Rabbi? Because they have the ability ultimately again to contract tumah through a zav or through someone else who is tamei sitting down on them. So because they have a strong tumah common denominator, therefore halacha l'maisa, they have the ability to combine. To which the Gemara says, Taimaduri and litami moshav. So ultimately, what do you see? They could combine because they share a common trait of tumas moshav. Aval ina roi litami moshav lo. But lamaisa, you would see if they don't share some type of common denominator like tumas moshav, they would not be able to combine. Which I will say tells you that under normal circumstances, items with different shiurim cannot combine to form a requisite shear. Yet you're telling me over here that the chamer item could combine with the kal item, even though it's true the kal item can't combine with the chamer item. But why should even the chamer item be able to combine with the kal item if at the end of the day they have different shiurim? So which the Gemara says, Amarava, so Rava says, Amad Beis, Hachanami chazya ledugma. So Rabbi say ultimately again here these items in the Mishnah could also combine. How do they combine? Let's listen to this. Very interesting. Ledugma, meaning for sale purposes. Now, what is this? That's quite fascinating. Look at Rashi. Ledugma, mishi yesh lo limkar sober mikulan, v'nosein lifnei chalono laharosh yesh lo limkar mikulan. V'nechalei shiyu mechubarin yachad, da'idi dezutre kol chad v'chad, haruach mifaz rasa. Let's listen to this. So apparently, the way it used to work was as follows. If you, let's say, had a store that sold animal feed. I'm just using animal feed because that's the example of the Mishnah. So we'll say what merchants would often do is they would pile a lot of different things next to each other in the window of the store. So what would happen? You would pass by the store, right? You would see the item in the window. You'd say, he's got eitzah, he's got teven, he's got onion leaves, garlic leaves, whatever it is. So because I'll say it's common to pile these items together. Remember, if you would put a small pile, the problem is the wind would come along and blow it away. You make a larger pile, it stays in place. So because it was common for shopkeepers to go ahead and combine these items really as like an advertisement in their store window, therefore these items are considered to be combinable items, and therefore halacha l'maisa, even though they have separate shiurim, they do have the ability to combine. And therefore halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says yes, therefore remember, now the combination only goes in one direction. That which is chamer can combine with that which is kal. That which is kal cannot combine with that which is chamer. But l'maisa, at the end of the day, they are still mitzdarif in that way. Beautiful. Mishnah, say last Mishnah on the parak. Hamotzi ochlim kigrogeres chayiv. So we'll say now in general, when it comes to food, right now we'll say up until now, we were talking about the shear for items that are really used for animal feed. And therefore, again, their unit of chashivos is defined by how much you would normally give to an animal. That is true. Now, we'll say when it comes to food items, stamp food items, right? Consumable by people. So what's the halacha? What's their shear? Hamotzi oklim kigrogeres chayiv. If you go ahead and you take out food, right? You carry food on Shabbos. The shear for chiyuv is kigrogeres, the size of a dried fig. Umitztarfim zemzeb, and remember, food items combine with each other. We'll say, why do food items combine with each other? Ultimately, again, because they have the same shear. So we'll say, so for example, if on Shabbos I carry a half a kizayis of cholent and a half a kizayis of kishka, kishka and cholent are not the same food. They're two different foods, but they're both food. They're both food. So because they're both food, every food item, when we say food, stuff that people eat, every food item, the shear for hotzah is a grogeres. So because that is the shear, therefore halacha l'maisa, food items can combine. So a half a grogeres of this, a half a grogeres of that, ultimately will combine with one another. Chutz mikli pasan, v'garinehen, v'uktsehen. So also with the exception of the shell, so if you're talking about a food item that has a shell, halacha l'maisa, again, because the shell is not edible, therefore it does not contribute to the shear. So also this is very important. So let's say you took out an orange, right, or something else, doesn't matter, whatever is with the shell, right? So because the shell does not go towards the grogeres amount, the volume of a fig, the dried fig. Halacha l'maisa, again, it is independent of the shell. The garinehen and the seeds, because again, remember that's not edible as well. Vuktsein and the stems. V'suban umursanan. And ultimately, so also we're going to see suban and mursanan. Suban, Rashi says, is klipas chitin and asharis machmas kesisha. So we'll say, really, this is bran. Suban and mursanan are bran. So suban is the shell of the wheat that comes out when the wheat is being pounded, and mursanan is the rest of the bran that comes out when the wheat or when the flour is being sifted. Rabbi Huda Omer, chutz miklipe adashin shemispashal siman. Rabbi Huda says the exception to this is, right? Also, not Rashi says. Sorry, Rabbi Huda says also except for the shells of the legumes that the legumes are cooked in. Look at Rashi just a moment. Rabbi Huda Omer, kol klipin in mitztarfi gida amran chutz miklipe adashin. So Rabbi Huda was just saying, even though we normally say that ultimately, again, the shell of a food item does not combine towards its shear, the exception to that rule, says Rabbi Huda, ultimately is what? The shells of lentils. Why? Because ultimately, again, the lentil is cooked in it, and because of that, the shell ultimately becomes part of the lentil. She says, "Lafuke klipa chitzona shengedelas besocha noshos begoren." So we'll say, so apparently, lentils often have two shells. One shell comes off when it's being threshed, but there's a second shell that the lentil is cooked in. Because the lentil is cooked in that shell, Rabbi Huda says that shell counts towards the shear. Beautiful. Says the Gemara. The Suban umorsanon lo mitzdarfen. Is that true? That Abbas, remember again, Suban and morsanon both kind of translate the same way. They both translate as bran. Suban will translate as like coarse bran, and marsanon is fine bran. The suban is the bran that comes off when you're initially pounding the wheat, and the morsanon is the bran that comes off when you're sifting the wheat, and you're sifting the flour. So the Gemara says, is that true? That the bran doesn't combine for the shear? Vatnan, we learned, chameshes revayim kemach, va'od chayavim mechala. Yes, we learned that what? Chameshes revayim, right? Four revesim, ultimately again of flour, are chayiv in chala. And what goes towards that shear? Hain, it's the flour, v'suban umorsinon. And ultimately, again, together with the coarse bran and the fine bran. So you see from here, there was at least legabe chala. When trying to figure out how much flour you used, the amount of flour also includes the amount of the bran. To which the Gemara says, no. Amar Abaye shekein ani ochel pito beisa belusa. But say this is different. When it comes to chala, it's different. Why? Because halacha lemaisa, an ani, a poor person, will go ahead and eat wheat bread with bran mixed in. Look at Rashi belusa miureves besubna ubemorsina hilchach lechem haaretz kaminan bei umiyo leinyan Shabbos midi dechashiv ba'inan v'stamayhu dahani lav ochel ninus. So the Gemara actually makes a very interesting distinction here. When it comes to chala, what's going to contribute? Take it back. In order to be chayiv in chala, which is removal of a piece of dough from your dough for a kohen, you need to reach a certain amount of dough, right? Only if you have a certain amount of dough are you chayiv in chala. Here the Gemara is saying that, by the way, even the bran counts towards the actual amount of the dough. Okay, but one second, we just said before that for Shabbos purposes, right, the shear that you're chayiv for carrying a food item is a grogeres, the size of a fig. And we said the bran doesn't count towards that. So which one is it? Does bran count or bran doesn't count? So the Gemara says, it depends. It depends. For Shabbos, it does not count. For Hilchos Chala, it does count. Why? Because there are people who eat bread with bran mixed in. An ani, poor people would often, again, because they needed the bran, they didn't have enough flour without the bran, so they would have the bran mixed in to complete enough flour. So because people do eat bread with bran in it, therefore what? It's called hamotzi lechem in art, therefore chayv in chala. So we'll say, so therefore how we deal with bran depends on the case. For Hilchos Shabbos, bran will not go ahead and count towards filling out the requisite amount that would make you chayiv for hotzah. But for chala, bran will combine with the rest of the flour in order to get you up to the threshold in which you are chayiv to go ahead and take chala. We'll say it's very interesting that a lot of the things that we consider to be like higher end stuff, like more healthy today, right? Chazal were like, only poor people ate it, right? Whole wheat bread, no one ate whole wheat bread, right? That's what you ate when like there was nothing else left, right? Bran, no one ate bran. So it's just fascinating to see, right? From the Isaac Chazal, white bread was like the highest level of lechem, right? Bran, mamish, and all the stuff we're talking about, whole wheat bread, all for aniyim, regular people would never touch it. Interesting. All right, so the Gemara says as follows. Adashim, so the Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Huda Omer chutz miklipe adashim special sense. Rabbi Huda says, even though normally shells do not combine to form the requisite shear, ultimately again do not combine to form the shear of a grogeres of a dried fig. Rabbi Huda says the exception of this is the shells of adashim, of lentils, because ultimately they're cooked with them. So the Gemara says, adashim in pulin. Are you telling me that it's only, I will say now, we often translate adashim and pulin as the same thing, but the truth is there are different families or categories of lentils. So is it only adashim and not pulin? That Tanya Rabbi Huda Omer chutz miklipe pulin va'adashim. But Rabbi Huda says it's both the shells of adashim and pulin. To which the Gemara says, lo kasha, it's not a contradiction. Ha becharati, ha ba'atiki. One is talking about ultimately, again, we'll call it new lentils. One is talking about old lentils. So both say, so ultimately, again, when we say that halacha lemaisa, even the shells of the pulin could count towards the shear, that's when it's fresh pulin. But if it's old pulin, then the shells can't combine for the shear. Why not? My time alo, atiki my time alo. I'm gonna be avo mipnei shenirin kizvuvin beka'ara. Because apparently, when the shells of the older pulin come off the lentil, in that case, they look like dead flies. So because it looks like dead flies, no one eats it. No one, even though both say it's not dead flies, right? It's totally edible, but because it looks unappealing, therefore halacha l'maisa, people don't eat it. So therefore, both way it comes out is like this. Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, the shells of adoshim go ahead and combine to form the requisite shear. And it's not just adoshim, it's pulin also. But by pulin, it's only fresh shells and not old shells. Because fresh shells people will eat, but old shells, just because they look repulsive, people will not touch them. Hadron aloch klal gadosh garchabosai, absolutely incredible. So you know what, we'll stop over here for today. If you have any ashikach, we'll say, is Sammy Esterson on? I think Sammy Esterson is on. Sammy's going to lead davening. His minyan is starting at 6:45. So again, hatzlacha to everyone wherever they're davening today. For those who are utilizing Zoom for tefillah still, again, Sammy will be leading it live from his minyan. So we'll say yeshikach to everyone, and Baruch Hashem, beautiful participation today, and wishing everyone a wonderful day. Tomorrow, brand new parak together. Shah, Sammy's here.